He was small. You wouldn't notice him in a crowd, not because he tried to hide, but because he didn't need to be seen. Carlo Gambino was 5'7", soft-spoken, with a face that seemed carved from Sicilian stone. Not the kind of man who raised his voice, not the kind who smiled much either. But if you saw him walking slowly through the Brooklyn streets in the 1930s, jacket loose, eyes never blinking too long, you'd feel something shift, like the air changed, like silence followed him, not the other way around. Carlo was born in Palermo, Sicily, in 1902, but he didn't stay long. His bloodline was tied to the Mafia back home, not the flash and bravado type, the old ones, the quiet ones, the ones who never told you they were angry, but made you disappear before you could explain yourself. He learned early that noise was a weakness, that the ones who talked too much were usually the ones who bled first. So he didn't talk. Not much, not even as a boy. He watched, listened, memorized people's habits, tones, their lies. By the time he turned 19, he wasn't a kid anymore. He was part of the honored society, Cosa Nostra, and already trusted by people who didn't even trust their own brothers. And then, he left. Like a shadow across the Atlantic, Gambino boarded a merchant ship and slipped into America in 1921, hidden among fishermen and dock workers. No big welcome, no parade, just another immigrant with hungry eyes and silent ambition, stepping off a boat into a country built on opportunity and violence. The Brooklyn he arrived in wasn't the clean, polished dream painted in postcards. It was dirty, tight, alive. The kind of place where you had to fight for space. Italian neighborhoods were cramped, loud, suspicious. Kids ran through alleys, mothers leaned from windows, and the streets were ruled not by politicians, but by men with sharp suits and sharper knives. Carlo didn't rush into anything. That wasn't his way. He worked, he waited, he watched again. He found his circle, people from the same Sicilian cloth, people who understood that the game wasn't about who pulled the trigger first, but who pulled it last after everyone else was too scared to breathe. By the mid-1920s, Gambino had linked up with Salvatore Toto di Accola, one of the early Mafia bosses in New York. He wasn't high level yet, just a soldier. But there was something about him, something people couldn't ignore. He was disciplined, never questioned orders. Always knew when to disappear. Even then, the older guys whispered, "He's going to outlive us all." They didn't say it out of fear. They said it out of respect. That kind of thing mattered back then. Because in the world Gambino was building, respect was more dangerous than bullets. And in every bar, every back alley deal, every late-night conversation under a flickering light bulb, he earned more of it. Quietly, ruthlessly. He didn't chase power. He waited for it to slip into his hands, like it had no choice. And the more he waited, the more the city turned in his direction. The 1930s in New York were not loud with war. They whispered it. That's how it started. Murmurs, phone calls that dropped mid-sentence, strange cars parked too long outside brownstones, eyes that lingered just 1 second too long. There was no marching band, no soldiers in uniform, just mafiosi and fedoras, and too many funerals. The Castellamarese War was the kind of war you didn't read about in newspapers, not then, but it cracked the bones of the underworld and reshaped it forever. And Carlo Gambino? He walked through it without ever raising his voice. It started with blood. Salvatore d'Aquila, Carlo's first boss in New York, got clipped in 1928, shot dead in the streets like a dog. He had made too many enemies, too flashy, too bold. He thought being boss of bosses made him untouchable. It didn't. And as his body cooled on the pavement, the vultures began to circle. Every family, every street-level crew, every friend of ours saw the same thing, an opening. That's when Joe, the boss Masseria, stepped in. He wasn't subtle. He wanted to take everything, the numbers, the gambling, the unions, the ports. If you didn't bend the knee, you ended up face down in a hallway or stuffed in the back of a Buick. Masseria played by old rules. He was greedy, old-school Sicilian, arrogant, paranoid, treated his soldiers like garbage, and acted like New York was his personal empire. but another force was rising, a quiet storm from the old country. Salvatore Maranzano, head of the Castel Amaris faction, men from Sicily's seaside towns, smarter, more disciplined, and deadlier. Maranzano didn't like Masseria's sloppy methods. He wanted structure, military-style hierarchy, a code, rules. So the blood war began. Bodies dropped in restaurants, shot up in barber chairs, ambushed outside butcher shops. No warning, no drama, just death. Gambino? He watched. He didn't talk much during that time, not that he ever had. He kept his crew small, his moves smaller. He stayed under the radar while the two titans, Masseria and Maranzano, tore the city apart with their ego-fueled chess match. And while they burned bridges and murdered friends, Carlo studied. He saw what Masseria couldn't see, that loyalty doesn't come from fear. It comes from respect. And Masseria had none. He saw what Maranzano didn't understand, that being too rigid, too proud, could get you killed just as fast. And in the middle of it all was a young soldier named Lucky Luciano, sharp as a razor, playing both sides. Gambino and Luciano weren't close friends, not yet, but they moved in similar shadows. They understood the same language, survival first, power later. Carlo didn't care who won the war, he just made sure he wouldn't lose. That was the difference between him and the other guys. He didn't need to win every argument or show off every move. He was thinking 10 years ahead. Late one night, deep in Brooklyn, Carlo sat across from an old friend, a mid-level guy from the Diacola days. They were in the back of a bakery. The smell of bread hung heavy in the air, but the conversation had nothing to do with food. "He's gonna fall," the friend said, meaning Masseria. "I can feel it. Luciano's working something." Gambino didn't blink. He sipped his espresso, eyes scanning the shadows outside the window. Then he nodded, just once. Not approval, understanding. He already knew. Luciano was setting the stage to remove both Masseria and Maranzano. That was the plan. Kill the old way and build something new. Something American, structured, modern. A commission, an order. But Gambino didn't need to be on the front lines. He didn't join the conspiracies, didn't plant bombs or pull triggers. He didn't need to. Because when the dust settled, he'd still be standing. And that's exactly what happened. April 15th, 1931, Masseria was shot dead in a Coney Island restaurant. Weeks later, Maranzano was stabbed and shot in his office, betrayed by men he thought were loyal. Just like that, the war was over. And in the silence that followed, a new structure rose, the Commission, a governing body made of bosses from each major family. No more boss of bosses, just 5 families, 5 territories, 5 men to balance the crime empire like a crooked table that still stood. Luciano led it. Gambino. He got his reward quietly, placed under the Profaci family, handling operations in Brooklyn. Some said it was a step back. They didn't understand the man. Carlo didn't want the spotlight. He wanted control. The quiet kind. The kind that didn't come with newspaper headlines or FBI attention. He took numbers, bookmaking, protection rackets, and turned them into steady rivers of cash. No flash, no noise, just results. His crew grew. Quiet killers, smart soldiers, men who knew the code, and every time someone underestimated him, they disappeared. By 1937, most of the blood had dried. The city had been carved into blocks, territories, and ports. Luciano had been arrested and deported. Other bosses got sloppy. Some were killed, some just vanished. But Gambino, he kept moving in the same rhythm. Slow, careful, unnoticed. Every step was deliberate. Every word was weighed. He didn't chase power. He let power come to him. He once told a young associate, not loudly, not as a lesson, but just in passing, something that stayed with the kid for life. If you can't shut your mouth, you don't deserve to open it in the first place. That was Carlo. Not poetic, not philosophical, just a cold, clear code. And that code made him bulletproof in a world full of backstabbing, power-hungry maniacs. There was a night, one of those long, smoky Brooklyn nights where he walked alone down Atlantic Avenue. A light drizzle, distant sirens, the smell of rain and oil mixing in the gutter. He stopped at a street corner, lit a cigarette with his silver lighter. His eyes weren't looking at the road. They were looking ahead, into the next 10 years. He didn't see what most men saw. He saw what was missing, and he knew what was coming. Because the men ahead of him, Profaci, Mangano, even the commission itself, they were too busy celebrating their kingdoms. Gambino, he was already building his own. Brooklyn in the 1940s wasn't the same place Carlo Gambino had walked into as a wide-eyed 19-year-old immigrant. It was busier now, louder, darker in some places, cleaner in others, but no less dangerous. The war in Europe had changed things. Factories ran night and day. Soldiers in uniforms marched through the streets. Italian families kept quiet, afraid of being labeled spies. Everything was tense, nervous. But in the underworld, business never stopped. It just moved deeper. And Carlo, he didn't mind. The chaos was good for a man like him, because when everyone's distracted, no one sees the real game being played. Carlo Gambino was officially still just a capo in the Profaci family, operating a tight crew out of South Brooklyn, bookmaking, loan sharking, hijacking, numbers. But unofficially, he was becoming something else. He didn't argue with other capos. He didn't compete openly. He offered help, quietly, respectfully, and then waited for them to slip. And when they did, he never gloated. He just absorbed what they left behind. Men like that aren't noticed until it's too late. His operation was tight. His soldiers didn't get loud in clubs. They didn't show off in suits 2 sizes too bright. They didn't shoot people in the street unless they had to. They worked in silence, moved with discipline. Carlo had one rule above all others: never bring heat. And in the 1940s, heat came fast. The feds were watching. New York PD had their palms out, and J. Edgar Hoover was pretending the Mafia didn't even exist, while quietly building files inches thick. The big bosses, Joe Profaci, Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, they were all locked in their own power games, chasing territory, twisting unions, trying to make headlines disappear. Carlo stayed clear of it all. He loaned soldiers to the right men. He passed along whispers that saved lives, or ended them. He made sure everyone owed him something, and yet, his name was almost never spoken, only behind closed doors, only in low tones. Gambino? He's a good earner. Smart, doesn't talk much. Guy's like a ghost. But ghosts are dangerous when they start moving the furniture, and that's exactly what Gambino was doing. In 1943, a key player under Profaci, Anthony Tony Rags Raguzzo, was picked up by the feds on a narcotics charge. The guy ran a major heroin line out of Red Hook. Loud, flashy, too aggressive. When he got locked up, he expected someone to come bail him out, offer support, make the charge disappear. Nobody did, except Carlo. But Carlo didn't send lawyers. He sent a message, polite, respectful, and deadly clear. You're done. Don't speak. Don't come back. And Tony Rags, he stayed quiet, did his time, came out 5 years later, and found out every rack he once ran was now under Gambino's crew. No arguments, no shots fired, just absorbed. This was how Gambino operated in the 40s, like water. He didn't break doors down. He waited for the wood to rot, and then he walked through. And slowly, his influence began to stretch past Profaci. He had people inside the Anastasia family, in Lucche's territory. Even a few old Sicilian soldiers loyal to Maranzano's memory who didn't trust the new Americanized bosses. Carlo wasn't political. He was predictable, and in a world of screaming, impulsive gangsters that made him powerful. People wanted to work with him because he didn't play games, and when people owed him, they paid on time. He always. He didn't chase unions like the others, not yet. But he watched how they worked, how men like Genovese and Costello used the Teamsters like pawns on a board. He saw the power in shipping, trucking, and construction, the invisible arteries of the city. He wasn't ready yet, but he took notes. Gambino was always thinking 10 years out. He knew the old way of doing things, fear, bullets, loud reputations, wouldn't last forever. He was building something different, a machine that didn't make noise, didn't leave blood on sidewalks, one that ran itself, fueled by loyalty, greed, and silence. Then came the problem with Anastasia. Albert the Mad Hatter. Anastasia wasn't subtle. He loved being feared, loved power, loved the old-school kill or be killed style. He ran the Murder Inc. crew during the 30s and kept the title Lord High Executioner like a badge of honor. But times were changing, and Anastasia was too loud, too brutal, too unstable. He had no patience for finesse, and that made him a liability. Gambino saw it coming. He wasn't the only one. By the late 1940s, a quiet coalition began to form around Carlo. Men tired of the instability, the drama, the unnecessary heat. These weren't rebels. They were survivors. Men like Tommy Lucchese, Joe Bonanno, and future syndicate allies started looking at Gambino differently. Not just as a capable capo, but as a future boss, not of a crew, of a family, maybe even more. But Carlo? He didn't reach for it. He waited, and while everyone was watching the flash and fury of Anastasia and Genovese, Gambino was building a network. Ties to lawyers, judges, unions, dock workers, accountants, even priests. He gave quietly, built favors, earned trust, so that when things fell apart, he'd be the only man left standing who hadn't made any enemies. That was his genius. He understood the thing most gangsters never figured out. Power isn't something you take, it's something everyone gives you when they've got no one else left to trust. There's a story, probably half true, about a sit-down in 1949. An old-school mobster from out of town was visiting Brooklyn looking to settle a debt and find new business. He wanted to meet with Profaci, but the Don was unavailable, tied up, sent his apologies. So they offered him another meeting with a low-voiced Sicilian capo named Carlo Gambino. The visitor didn't know the name, didn't understand why this little man with the plain suit and quiet tone was sitting across the table, offering no promises, no threats, just suggestions. But the visitor walked out of that meeting, turned to his driver and said, "That guy is going to own New York one day." He wasn't wrong. Carlo didn't speak in ultimatums, didn't raise his voice, didn't talk about loyalty. He earned it. And by the time the 1940s closed and the city stepped into a new decade, Gambino had already outlasted more than a dozen rival capos. He had tripled his crew size, and more importantly, he had never been arrested, not once. Not even for a traffic ticket. That was no accident. That was the difference between him and the rest. He had a favorite spot, a diner off Bay Ridge Avenue. Cheap coffee, bad lighting, good privacy. He'd sit in the back with his hands folded, listening more than he spoke. He could sit there for hours, sipping from the same cup, nodding slowly while his men gave updates, shipments, payments, problems. And when someone brought him bad news, he never yelled. He just asked one question: "Can you fix it?" If the answer was yes, he nodded. If the answer was no, that person didn't sit with him again. Simple as that. That's what the 1940s were for Carlo Gambino. Not fireworks, not violence, just foundation. And like any good builder, he made sure the walls were deep, quiet, solid. Because he knew the day was coming when the roof above him would collapse. And when it did, he wouldn't be under it. He'd already be on top. The city was changing again. The war was over, and now New York in the early 1950s felt bigger, faster, louder. Skyscrapers were stretching taller, streets were more crowded, the country was booming. But in the corners of Brooklyn, where the air still smelled like oil and roasted garlic, the real power was still being passed in whispers. And Carlo Gambino was done waiting, not rushing, not grabbing, moving. He'd spent the last 2 decades building like a man with time, laying bricks while other men lit matches. Now, the foundation was done. His crew was loyal, disciplined, and spread out across every profitable corner of South Brooklyn. From loan sharking to ports, bookmaking to protection, he had a quiet hand in every pocket. He wasn't hungry, he was ready. And across the table sat a man who didn't see it coming. Albert Anastasia. Anastasia was a killer, always had been, built his reputation on blood and brutality. He ran Murder Inc. in the 30s, a death squad for the mob, pulling triggers coast to coast, hundreds of bodies under his name, though not one tied to him in court. He was muscle, fire, chaos, and for a long time he was necessary. But Gambino understood something Anastasia never could. Violence was a tool, not a strategy. The world was changing. The feds were watching. Cameras were everywhere. And Anastasia was still acting like it was 1929. Worse, he had become boss of the old Mangano family, the family Gambino served under, after Vincent Mangano mysteriously disappeared in 1951. No trial, no sit-down. Just gone. Everyone knew Anastasia killed him, his own boss. No vote, no permission. He claimed the throne with blood, not respect. And that was something Carlo could not forgive. See, Gambino didn't mind killing, but he hated chaos. He hated the kind of man who made the whole structure look weak, unstable. And Anastasia, he was cracking the pillars, shooting men in public, running his mouth to people outside the life, making enemies faster than friends, and most dangerous of all, he had no political instincts. He didn't see what was forming around him. He didn't see Carlo, but someone else did. Vito Genovese, the most dangerous player on the board, a cold-blooded tactician who had his own sights on the top. He'd already pushed out Frank Costello, taking over the Luciano family. But Genovese had bigger dreams. He wanted to be king of everything, and he knew Anastasia had to go, but he couldn't do it alone. So he turned to Gambino. The sit-down between them wasn't loud. It didn't happen in a mansion or some smoky back room filled with soldiers. It happened in a car, parked beneath a broken streetlight near Diker Heights. Two men, two kingdoms, one understanding. Genovese spoke first. "We've got a mad dog on a throne." Carlo said nothing. Genovese waited, then added, "You take his seat, I take the commission." Still silence. Carlo finally looked over, eyes calm, voice flat. "You make the mess, I clean it up." That was it. No threats, no promises, just the beginning of a silent coup. The next few months were carefully woven. Carlo didn't talk directly to shooters. He didn't call meetings. He didn't write a single word. He sent gestures. One crew moved out of a block Anastasia had wanted. A shipment got delayed. A soldier close to Albert started getting cold shoulders. Tiny things. But Albert noticed, and like a wild animal backed into a corner, he started lashing out. More violence, more paranoia. He thought Costello was behind it, thought Genovese was turning people against him. He had no idea his own underboss was gutting him from the inside. That's how it had to be. Anastasia was feared. If Gambino made one wrong move, it would start a war the commission wasn't ready for. So he stayed quiet and waited for the crack. It came on October 25th, 1957. Anastasia walked into the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, like he always did, to get a hot shave at the barbershop. No bodyguards, no fear. Just a gangster stuck in the past. As he leaned back in the chair, towel on his face, two men walked in. No masks, no words, just pistols drawn. They emptied their clips into Anastasia's face and chest. Blood sprayed across the mirrors. The barber ran. The whole shop shook. And just like that, the Lord High Executioner was dead. No witnesses, no arrests, just another corpse with enemies. The commission met 2 weeks later. Quiet nods, no questions, no mourning. The bosses knew who was responsible. They knew who had organized it, even if no one said the name. And when the question came, who takes the chair? There was no vote, no argument, just one name whispered like a priest offering last rites: Carlo Gambino. He didn't celebrate, didn't throw a party, didn't make speeches. He just showed up at the next meeting in Anastasia's seat. And the name changed. No longer the Mangano family, no longer the Anastasia crew. Now, it was the Gambino family. But make no mistake, Carlo knew what had just happened. He'd become the biggest target in New York. Being boss wasn't the end of the game. It was the beginning of a new one, and Gambino had no intention of playing by the same rules. His first move as boss? Clean house, Every loose cannon from Anastasia's era was either demoted, exiled, or quietly taken care of. Soldiers who got too greedy were told to retire or disappeared. Crews were restructured, power was balanced. He wasn't flashy, but he was firm. When a captain under him skimmed profits from a Fulton Street union deal, Carlo didn't yell. He had the man found in his own garage, slumped over the steering wheel of a Buick, still holding his coffee. Message delivered. His second move? Stabilize. Gambino made peace where needed. He reached out to the Lucchese's, strengthening the long-trusted alliance with Tommy Lucchese, who ran his family like a business. Together, they rebuilt the Commission's power quietly, without the grandstanding of the old days. He avoided wars, avoided headlines. He built roots through Cuba, Miami, Chicago. He cemented relationships with corrupt union bosses, politicians, judges. He had the ports, the garbage, the construction, even pieces of the garment district. But unlike the others, he never drew attention to himself. He let other families take the heat, take the press. Gambino just kept collecting envelopes. His final move in the 50s? Family, not blood, structure, order. He created a system where decisions didn't rest on rage or ego. Each crew knew their cut. Each captain knew their lane. No overlaps, no noise. He instilled fear wrapped in respect, the kind that made men sit straight when he entered the room. They called him Don Carlo now, not loudly, not to his face, but always with weight, because they knew the quiet Don had become a king. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, just a gathering, that's how they called it. A simple meeting of minds between some of the most powerful men in America. No guns, no threats, no drama. Just old friends, cigars, and business. They chose a quiet little town, Appalachian, New York, a nowhere dot on the map surrounded by woods, fresh air, and nosy neighbors with nothing better to do than notice strangers. It was a mistake, one of the biggest the American Mafia ever made, and for most of them, it was the beginning of the end. But not for Carlo Gambino. By late 1957, just weeks after Albert Anastasia's death, the dust hadn't even settled in the streets. The old guard was either dead, exiled, or hiding. Vito Genovese, hungry and smug, had finally claimed his prize, full control of the Genovese family, and he wasn't done. He wanted more. He wanted legitimacy, recognition. So Genovese called for a meeting, a big one. Every major boss in the country would be invited. Joe Barbara, a mobster with a big house and a bigger mouth, offered his estate in upstate New York, secluded, spacious, with a long driveway and too many Cadillacs pulling up for the locals not to notice. It was arrogance disguised as strategy. And Carlo knew it. When Gambino got the invite, he didn't say yes. He didn't say no either. He watched. He listened. His people told him what the setup looked like. Dozens of made men arriving in shiny suits, stepping out of cars with New Jersey plates and Southern accents. Cooks prepping pounds of meat and pasta, liquor flowing like it was a celebration. Too loud, too risky, too exposed. But he went. Not because he trusted the meeting, not because he respected Genovese. He went because he had to be seen. He had just taken the throne of the Gambino family. And absence, in this world, looked too much like fear. So he dressed simply, dark coat, flat cap, no entourage, and he made the drive north, hours through winding roads and rain-washed highways. But he didn't bring a suitcase, didn't plan to stay long, and when he arrived, he didn't rush to the tables like the others. He stayed near the edge of the crowd, watched the woods, kept one hand near the car door. Because Carlo Gambino wasn't stupid, he knew this was a trap waiting to be sprung. He wasn't wrong. At 11 a.m., as the men were settling in, local police and state troopers began surrounding the property. Some neighbors had tipped them off. Strange cars, too many men with Italian surnames, license plates from out of state. But what really caught the cops' attention? A butcher's truck unloading crates of meat. No one ordered that much food in a town like Appalachian, unless something was going down. And when the police began checking plates, they recognized names, real names, tied to open cases, wiretaps, bodies. The net closed fast, and inside the house, panic erupted. Men in $1,000 suits scrambled like rats. Some ran through the backyard, some darted into the woods, some tried climbing fences, diving into muddy creeks. Vito Genovese was one of the first caught, tackled in the grass like a common thug. Others hid in the basement, sweating through silk shirts, begging for someone to make it all go away. It was a circus. The Cosa Nostra, La Mafia, the invisible empire, suddenly caught in the open, exposed like fools. And in the middle of it all, Carlo Gambino was already gone. He had seen the signs minutes before the raid. He noticed the twitch in the housekeeper's face, the sudden silence of the birds, the unnatural stillness in the air. He knew something wasn't right, so he turned to his driver and said 6 words. "Get me out. No questions, now." They pulled away just minutes before the troopers stormed in. No panic, no screaming, just a quiet exit, Gambino style. In the weeks that followed, over 60 mobsters were detained, questioned, booked, and paraded through the press like war trophies. Newspapers plastered photos of terrified gangsters dripping in mud, trying to hide their faces. The government had its moment. The myth of no organized crime shattered. The American public now knew the Mafia wasn't a Hollywood story. It was real, and it was everywhere. The FBI, which had long denied the Mafia's existence, now had no choice but to respond. Files opened, surveillance increased, indictments drafted, and in the middle of the storm, Carlo Gambino sat untouched. When the feds came knocking at his door weeks later, they found him sitting on the stoop in Brooklyn, reading a newspaper. He greeted them politely, answered no questions. "Were you an Appalachian, Mr. Gambino?" He shrugged. "Never heard of it." "You sure? You weren't seen there?" "I was home with my wife," he said. "You can ask her." They did. She said the same. And that was that. No charges, no photos, no press. He slipped through the net, just like always. And this is what made Gambino different. Other bosses wanted to be seen. They liked the power, the image, the swagger. But Carlo? He played the long game. He let others take the heat while he built his empire behind the curtain. In the months after Appalachian, the Mafia's grip on America shifted. Some families grew paranoid. Others collapsed. All eyes were on Genovese, now arrested and facing drug charges. He swore he'd beat the rap, swore his enemies would pay. But those enemies had already begun carving up his kingdom. Gambino moved carefully. He met with Tommy Lucchese, Joe Bonanno, and other remaining power players. They didn't talk about revenge or retaliation. They talked about control, about order, about how to take this mess and shape it into something stronger. And at the head of the table, Carlo Gambino. He wasn't the loudest voice, but every man leaned in when he spoke, because they knew what he had done. They knew he had seen the trap before it was sprung and left the others to choke on their own pride. And more than anything, they knew Gambino's rise was no accident. He used Appalachian as a filter. After the arrests, the indictments, the media storms, Gambino moved fast. Any soldier arrested in Appalachian, gone, replaced. Any capo who showed weakness under questioning, removed. He cleaned house like a surgeon. And his family, the newly christened Gambino family, it tightened, expanded, strengthened. He absorbed struggling crews, took over docks left unguarded, built bridges into Chicago, Miami, even Vegas. And he did it all without raising a gun or a headline. Just envelopes, phone calls, nods, whispers of the silent dawn. There's a moment, a quiet one, that people close to Gambino remember. It wasn't public, no meetings, just a conversation between Carlo and a young soldier who asked him something naive. "Don Carlo, when will we be safe?" Carlo looked up from his espresso. He didn't smile. He just said, "When we stop believing we are." That was the code. That was the truth. Appalachian wasn't the end of the Mafia. It was the end of its invisibility. And Carlo Gambino, the man no one could catch, became its new face, not to the public, but to the men who survived. They saw who walked out of the flames untouched, and they knew who the real boss was now. Not Genovese, not Bonanno, not Lucchese, Gambino, the man who never raised his voice, but always got the last word. The 1960s began like a wave no one saw coming. Elvis was fading, the Beatles were rising, men were dying in Vietnam, cities were shaking with protests, and America was burning in ways nobody could control. The world changed its rhythm. But in Brooklyn, Carlo Gambino never broke stride. He didn't care about revolutions. He didn't care about presidents. He didn't care who sat behind the Oval Office desk. All that mattered to Carlo was that his envelopes kept arriving on time, and his name stayed out of the headlines. And both things were happening more than ever. Because while other bosses were crumbling, deported, jailed, shot, or simply forgotten, Carlo Gambino was growing into something more than a boss. He was becoming the center of the web. By 1961, Gambino controlled the most powerful and wealthiest mafia family in America. The Gambino family had over 500 made men, with thousands of associates. Their reach stretched from New York to Miami, from the docks of New Jersey to the casinos of Havana, from the Teamsters unions to garment district showrooms. And everywhere they went, they left no trail. Because Gambino demanded discipline, silence, loyalty, but most of all, no attention. He watched how other families drew fire. Joe Bonanno got too greedy, tried organizing a secret takeover of the commission behind everyone's back. He called it the banana coup. Gambino crushed it in silence. He didn't send shooters, he sent votes. Bonanno was labeled a traitor, a coward. He was chased out of town like a beaten dog, and the commission now had one real voice that mattered: Don Carlo. Even the Lucchese family, long known as Gambino's closest allies, began moving more in line with him. When Tommy Lucchese, his friend and partner, passed away in 1967, Gambino made sure the next boss, Carmine Tramunti, knew exactly where the wind blew. And when Tramunti eventually stumbled, Gambino's own son-in-law, Paul Castellano, was quietly positioned to take influence behind the scenes. That was Carlo's brilliance. He didn't just build his own family, he infected the others with loyalty, until the Mafia itself bent toward his will. But no empire stays clean, even one built on silence, because as Gambino grew older, his own family, his blood, began hungering for more. Paul Castellano had married Carlo's daughter, Nina. He wasn't a street guy, not like the old-timers. He wore tailored suits, spoke with polished English, ate at white tablecloth restaurants, and read Wall Street Journal articles like scripture. He didn't like violence, didn't like dirt. He preferred business, legitimate fronts, construction deals, white-collar thefts. And Carlo? He loved it. Not because Castellano was a killer, but because he wasn't. To Carlo, the future of the Mafia was not bullets, it was banks. But not everyone agreed, especially not Agnello Della Croce, the underboss, the muscle, the man who had served loyally for decades from the street level up. Della Croce was old school, blood before business, rules before family. He didn't say much, he didn't argue with Carlo. But in private, he was watching Castellano closely. He saw the soft hands, the business-first attitude, the disrespect to the old ways. And he wasn't alone. Many of the young soldiers, especially from Brooklyn crews, began to murmur, "That guy? He's going to be boss one day because he married into it?" They didn't like it, but they wouldn't say it to Carlo. Not yet. Still, Gambino wasn't blind. He knew Della Croce deserved something, so he split the family quietly. Castellano would run the white-collar side. Della Croce would control the street crews, the blue-collar muscle. It was a temporary fix, a quiet compromise, a ticking clock. Meanwhile, Carlo was still pulling bigger strings than anyone could imagine. His fingers were in the Cuban exile community, laundering money through anti-Castro channels. His reach touched CIA front operations, smuggling weapons and cash for black bag deals. His lieutenants had business ties in Vegas casinos, Miami drug ports, and union headquarters across 5 states. And somehow, he stayed invisible. No arrests, no charges, no public exposure. while men like Genovese, Bonanno, Colombo all took public beatings and federal cases. Carlo Gambino just aged like a statue. One reporter from the New York Post tried to track him down in 1966, trying to snap a photo. The reporter was told Gambino lived in a modest home in Brooklyn. No guards, no gates. He went, waited hours. When Gambino stepped out, he was wearing a brown sweater and scuffed shoes. He looked like a retired baker. When asked for a quote, Gambino just shook his head, smiled faintly, then went back inside. That photo never ran. The reporter found his car with 4 slashed tires the next morning. Lesson learned. But inside Carlo's circle, things were heating up. His nephew, Emmanuel Manny Gambino, had grown restless. He wasn't made, but he carried the last name, and that meant something. To some, it meant protection. To Manny, it meant entitlement. He started pushing into loan sharking, throwing his weight around, shaking down restaurant owners and corner shops in Jersey like he was untouchable. He wasn't careful. He didn't follow the code. And worse, he crossed into territories he didn't control. One of them belonged to a low-level crew tied to the Nardi brothers, independent gangsters out of Newark with no love for the 5 families. And when Manny refused to back down, he vanished. His body was found weeks later, buried in a shallow grave in New Jersey, beaten, tortured, shot in the face. Even though he wasn't made, the killing of a Gambino by blood couldn't go unpunished. The commission met. Even they knew this could start a war. But Gambino, he didn't yell. He didn't order a mass hit. He didn't make a scene. He waited. And then, months later, without fanfare, the Nardi brothers were gunned down one by one. Carlo never took credit, but everyone knew. You don't kill a Gambino and keep breathing, even if you're family, and even if Carlo didn't like you. After that, the message was clear again. Carlo never lost control. Not over the commission, not over his soldiers, not even over his own blood. By the end of the 1960s, the world outside was changing faster than ever. Men were walking on the moon. New York was broke. The hippies were fading, and cocaine was taking over the streets. The Mafia was facing something new, irrelevance. But Carlo, he was stronger than ever. Because while the world burned, he had built something that couldn't be touched by time. Fear, respect, control. And even the FBI, the mighty bureau, could barely scratch him. They had files, tapes, photos, but no proof, no charges. He was a ghost, a king without a crown, and everyone knew. When Carlo Gambino died, something bigger would die with him. By the time the 1970s rolled in, Carlo Gambino was nearly 70. But age didn't soften him, it refined him. He moved slower, spoke even less, showed up in public rarely, if ever. But make no mistake, Carlo was still in charge. He had no office, no throne. He ruled from a modest brick home in Brooklyn, where the lawn was always trimmed, the blinds were always closed, and the lights in the upstairs bedroom flickered past midnight. The world outside was loud, dirty, dying in some ways. New York was falling apart. Crime was rising. The subways stank like rust and urine, garbage piled in corners. Cops were underpaid, overworked, and mostly on someone's payroll. The old city was rotting. But Gambino, he thrived in decay. Because when things fall apart, people look for order, and he gave them that, one envelope at a time. He built a machine so efficient, it ran itself. Every crew reported in, every book stayed clean, every cash flow, whether from dockyard thefts, union kickbacks, construction bids, or drug tributes, moved like water through pipes only he could see. But his most brilliant move? Staying human. He kept a small circle, took care of his men's families, never showed off, never drew headlines. And when someone crossed the line, he didn't argue, he didn't threaten, they simply disappeared. But time, even for kings, always wins. By 1971, Gambino's heart was giving out. He had a hereditary condition, same one that killed his brother. The doctor said, "You're on borrowed time." Carlo nodded, then got back to work. See, the most important decision of his life was still ahead, Who would take over? And this wasn't just about replacing himself. This was about preserving everything. Because Gambino didn't just want to rule the Mafia, he wanted to reshape it forever. The natural choice, the one everyone expected, was Agnello Neil Della Croce. Old school, loyal, proven. Della Croce had run the street crews for years. He was feared, respected. Men would kill for him without blinking. But Carlo didn't want another killer. He didn't want the old Mafia to return. The bloodshed, the screaming, the heat from the feds. He wanted a businessman. Someone who understood the future wasn't in guns. It was in unions, concrete, hijacked shipping contracts, and white-collar crime. And that man was Paul Castellano, his brother-in-law, his son-in-law, his successor. It wasn't a popular choice. Castellano had never done time, never whacked anyone himself, barely spent time with the street crews, wore tailored suits, talked about margins and boardroom deals. He acted more like a corporate CEO than a don. But that was exactly why Carlo wanted him. Because Carlo understood what most gangsters didn't. The future of organized crime had to be organized. So in private, Carlo started laying bricks. He strengthened Castellano's grip on the white-collar rackets, construction bids, the food distribution monopoly, concrete unions, trucking, the garment district, waste management. He made sure Castellano had soldiers loyal to him placed in key crews, not street toughs, but calculating earners. And most of all, he kept Della Croce in the dark. Now, that's not to say Carlo disrespected Della Croce. Far from it. In fact, Carlo reassured him, praised him, gave him control of the Ozone Park crew, and allowed him to run the blue-collar muscle his own way. But he made one thing clear, without saying a word. When I go, Paul takes the throne. Some of Della Croce's loyalists didn't like it. Whispers began. We built this. Now it goes to a guy who's never done real dirt? Gambino didn't answer those whispers. He crushed them. One by one, men who spoke too loudly found themselves exiled, demoted, or buried. A soldier named Vinny Tocco ran his mouth about Castellano at a Brooklyn social club. Said he'd never follow a suit-wearing accountant. A week later, he went missing. They found him in the trunk of his own car, throat cut, hands broken. That's how Gambino kept control. Even when his body failed, his fear lived on. Then came 1972. Joe Colombo, head of the Colombo family, was shot in front of thousands during an Italian-American rally in Manhattan. A black activist pulled the trigger. Some claimed it was a rogue hit. Others said it was ordered, quietly, by the commission. Colombo had drawn too much heat. He'd turned the Mafia into a public circus, launching an Italian civil rights league, going on TV, stirring attention, marching like a political figure. Carlo hated it. He believed the Mafia survived by hiding, not waving flags. So when Colombo got shot, Gambino said nothing, just like always. But some insiders swear he greenlit the hit behind the curtain. Either way, the message was clear. Attention brings death. And Don Carlo, in his final years, was cleaning house one last time. He held fewer meetings, let Castellano run more day-to-day operations. But he never stopped watching. He had men loyal only to him, reporting everything. He knew who was unhappy. He knew who pretended to respect Paul, but resented the bloodline choice. And most of all, he knew the man who would one day challenge it all. John Gotti. Gotti was still young, in his 30s, running hijacking crews at JFK Airport, earning fast cash, getting noticed. He was close to Della Croce, but had no love for Castellano. Gambino had heard about him, sharp, unpredictable, wild. He told one of his inner circle, that boy's going to be a problem, but not mine. Because Don Carlo was preparing to leave, and when he did, he wanted it all to look peaceful, like the kingdom would survive without war. So in 1975, he called a final sit-down, private, tight, just inner circle members. No soldiers, no captains, just bosses. There, he made it clear. Paul would be boss. Della Croce would remain underboss running the streets. They would be two wings of the same family, and there would be no arguing. Everyone nodded, No one spoke. Because when Carlo looked you in the eyes, even at 73, even half dead from heart failure, you still felt like death was sitting in your lap. He made one final demand. No violence, not while I'm alive. And everyone agreed. They meant it, or pretended to, because the truth was, the second he died, everything would change. But Carlo didn't fear death, not after what he'd built, not after 50 years of survival. He'd outlasted Capone, Luciano, Genovese, Anastasia, Bonanno, Colombo, Costello. He had buried them all, and now he would choose the ending of his own story. Quietly, calmly. On October 15th, 1976, Carlo Gambino died in his own home, in his own bed, from a heart attack. No bullets, no betrayal, no trial, no handcuffs, just silence. The same silence he gave the world his whole life. His funeral was private, no spectacle, no flashy cars, no 1,000-man processions like the others, just family, a few mourners, and hundreds of detectives watching from across the street. But in the underworld, a storm was brewing. Because the second Gambino's heart stopped beating, the Mafia stopped breathing the same air. And the seeds he planted, Castellano as boss, Della Croce running muscle, Gotti on the rise, were about to collide in fire and blood. The day after Carlo Gambino's funeral, the streets of Brooklyn didn't mourn. They waited. In backroom poker games, in butcher shops, in dimly lit diners where soldiers drank bitter coffee and whispered over meatball sandwiches, the question hung in the air. So, Castellano, huh? No one said it loud, but everyone felt it, that knot in the chest, that sour taste that came from knowing the wrong man now had the crown. Paul Castellano was official, the new boss of the Gambino family, appointed by Carlo himself, blood family, a quiet, obedient earner who kept the books clean and the prosecutors confused. But he wasn't respected in the streets, not really, not by the ones who had bled for the family. Not by the ones who built the empire Carlo left behind. And definitely not by John Gotti. Castellano ran things from a mansion in Tot Hill, Staten Island, a white-columned estate that looked like a senator lived there. He wore double-breasted suits and spoke about business ventures and investment structures like a stockbroker. He wanted to turn the Mafia into a legitimate enterprise, one with front companies, lawyers, accountants, and political ties. He banned his men from drug dealing, even though half the street money came from heroin. He barely left Staten Island, rarely met with street captains in person, and refused to get his hands dirty. To him, the Mafia was a business model, but to men like Gotti, it was a brotherhood of wolves, and wolves don't take orders from sheep in suits. Agnello Della Croce, Carlo's old underboss, was still alive, still respected. He ran the street side of the family from the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy. The guys loved him, trusted him. If Carlo was the quiet brain, Neil was the beating heart. But Della Croce kept his word to Carlo. He swore no war would happen as long as he lived, so he kept Gotti in check. He told the young hothead, "You don't like Paul? That's fine, but he's boss now. You move on him, you move on me." Gotti bit his tongue, but he never forgot those words. Gotti's crew was based out of Ozone Park, Queens. Rough, flashy, wild. They hijacked trucks, ran gambling rings, took a healthy slice from every heroin deal in Brooklyn, and they made money. Lots of it. More than some captains, more than Paul's favored white-collar guys. But Castellano? He barely acknowledged them. He saw Gotti and his men as unruly, too visible, too old school. Worse, he suspected them of dealing drugs, a line Paul had drawn deep in the concrete. So Castellano began watching them. He sent eyes, sent quiet warnings. And in the underworld, a warning is a contract waiting for a signature. The tension built like a slow leak in a gas line. Then, in 1983, it nearly exploded. Angelo Ruggiero, one of Gotti's closest guys, got caught on an FBI wiretap talking about heroin. Bad idea. Castellano found out. He demanded the tapes. He wanted names, evidence, and if Gotti was on them, he wanted permission to whack him. Della Croce refused. "That's my guy. I gave you Paul, but you won't touch him." It was the first real crack. Paul backed down, but he never forgot the insult. From that day on, Gotti knew his days were numbered. As long as Castellano lived, he started planning, not loudly, not recklessly, but clearly. He told one associate, "That fat fuck lives in a castle while we bleed in the streets. I got no respect for that. And soon, neither will anyone else." Still, nothing happened yet, because Neil Della Croce was still alive. He was the last thread holding the two worlds together, the street and the suit, the soldier and the boss. Gotti didn't love him, but he respected him enough to wait. Meanwhile, Castellano was busy making mistakes. He grew more arrogant, more isolated. He met with Wall Street guys more than capos. He refused to show up at Gambino family wakes or weddings. He thought himself untouchable. But in truth, he was walking into his grave. 1985 was the turning point. October 15th. The same day, Carlo Gambino died 9 years earlier. Neil Della Croce passed away. Cancer, silent, fast, ruthless, he died without fanfare. And with him died the last shield between Gotti and Castellano. Paul didn't even show up at the funeral. Not out of disrespect, he claimed. He said he didn't want to draw attention, but that sealed his fate. Because to the men in Ozone Park and Bay Ridge in Little Italy, that was betrayal. You don't skip your underboss's funeral. You don't abandon the street guys and expect them to protect you. And Gotti, he knew it was time. He called his crew into a closed-door meeting. No outsiders, just his core guys. Sammy Gravano, Frank DeCicco, Angelo Ruggiero, Joseph Piney, Armone. They sat around a diner table. No pasta, no wine, just coffee and silence. Gotti didn't ask permission. He gave the word. "We're doing this. No more waiting. We take him out. Clean, public, fast, before he clips us first." The plan was simple. Shock and awe, no hiding. Just a message to the entire Mafia. The streets still matter. They picked the date, December 16th, 1985. Castellano would be meeting at Sparks Steakhouse, Midtown Manhattan. His driver, Thomas Bellotti, would be with him. No bodyguards, just routine. The perfect hit. December 16th, 1985. New York City was dressed in winter. Wind knifing through side streets, steam rising from subway grates, and traffic crawling like blood through clogged arteries. Midtown Manhattan was packed with businessmen, tourists, Christmas shoppers. And at Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street, someone was about to die. Not just someone. The boss of the Gambino crime family. And it wasn't going to be quiet. Paul Castellano had no idea he was walking into a death sentence. He thought it was business. A sit-down with Thomas Bellotti, his newly named underboss, and a few captains. Usual stuff. He pulled up in a Lincoln Town car at 5:26 p.m. Shiny, black, predictable. Bellotti was driving. Castellano sat in the passenger seat thumbing through a folded paper, probably thinking about steak, about union contracts, about how his empire was stronger than ever. He never saw the men waiting on the sidewalk. Because they didn't wear masks, they didn't hide in alleyways. They stood in the cold, dressed like businessmen, hands in pockets, faces calm. But their pockets were full of 357 Magnums and 38 Specials, and their eyes were full of intent. John Gotti sat in a car just up the block, watching. He didn't need to do the shooting. He was the orchestrator, not the button man. But he wanted to see it happen. He wanted to witness the moment the Mafia changed forever, the moment the old rules died and his rules began. The Lincoln pulled up. Castellano stepped out, buttoned his coat, adjusted his scarf. Two men approached. No words, no warning. 6 shots rang out, 3 into Castellano's chest, close range. He staggered, fell, died before he hit the ground. Bellotti barely had time to open his door. He was shot 4 times, head, neck, shoulder, slumped over the steering wheel, horn blaring. Blood sprayed across the sidewalk. People screamed, cars slammed on brakes. The shooters vanished into the crowd, and Gotti's car drove off calmly into the Christmas traffic. It was the boldest mob hit in New York history. Broad daylight. Midtown, no disguises. No one had dared to kill a sitting boss like that since Maranzano in 1931, and even then, it was done in secret. But this was a message. A gunshot sent straight through the chest of Carlo Gambino's legacy. Back at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, the news spread fast. Some couldn't believe it. Others stood in silence. But the older guys, they knew what this meant. John Gotti had just taken the throne by force. For decades, the Mafia lived by one golden rule. You don't kill a boss without the commission's approval. Gotti had just burned that rule alive. He hadn't asked, he hadn't warned, he hadn't cared. To him, Castellano wasn't a boss. He was a disgrace. He represented everything Gotti hated: suits, silence, business over blood, structure over instinct. And now, he was gone. The commission was furious, especially the Genovese and Lucchese families who'd supported Castellano. They called emergency meetings. Some wanted Gotti killed immediately to restore the old order, but others paused. Because in the streets, something strange was happening. The soldiers loved Gotti. He had charisma, swagger. He made them feel like gangsters again, not accountants. He walked through Little Italy like a king, wearing $1,000 suits, shaking hands, flashing smiles. He was on the news, in the papers, on TV. The Dapper Don, they called him. The FBI watched in disbelief. Who kills a boss and becomes a celebrity overnight? John Gotti did. Back at Sparks, Castellano's blood hadn't dried before men began switching sides. Captains who once backed Castellano now offered loyalty to Gotti. Not because they believed in him, but because they feared being next. And Gotti? He played it perfectly. He didn't apologize. He didn't deny it. He just kept smiling and walking, like he was daring the world to stop him. But not everyone smiled. Salvatore, Sammy the Bull Gravano, Gotti's underboss and enforcer, had helped organize the hit. He believed in Gotti's vision, at first, but inside he was watching, and he didn't like what he saw. Because while Carlo Gambino built his power in silence, Gotti was building it on headlines. TV cameras outside the Ravenite Club, reporters asking questions about his suits, tabloids calling him the Teflon Don, because trials never stuck. And every photo, every headline, every word drew more heat. The FBI was already watching. Now they poured resources into wiretaps, undercover agents, phone bugs, informants. They planted devices in social clubs, under tables, inside lamps. They caught everything. And Gotti, he didn't care. He talked in the open, told jokes, gave orders, called guys rats out loud. He thought he was invincible. But the walls were closing in. Meanwhile, back in the minds of the old men, something darker was growing. This isn't what Carlo wanted, because even those who hated Castellano couldn't deny one thing. Carlo Gambino never would have allowed this. He built an empire on control. He believed in subtlety, patience, strategy. But now the family he'd left behind was being ruled by a TV star in a silk tie. And still, in the streets, Gotti thrived. He moved into Castellano's spot without hesitation, took over the union contracts, took control of the crews, began reshaping the family in his own image. He put flashy men in powerful seats, promoted loyalists, not thinkers, rewarded loud earners over quiet strategists. It was working, for now. But the whispers had begun, inside clubs, in corner booths, behind closed doors. He's making us look like fools. He's bringing too much heat. He's not Gambino. And in the silence, the ghost of Carlo Gambino lingered, not forgotten, but watching. Because Carlo had built something meant to last forever, not through force, but through fear. And now, it was being undone by a man who laughed on camera while the feds closed in. Still, for a moment, Gotti stood untouchable. Paul Castellano was dead. The family was his. The city bowed. But behind every king, there's always a knife waiting in the dark, and John Gotti was about to learn. Even Dapper Dons bleed. The hit on Paul Castellano was supposed to be the start of something, and it was. but not the way John Gotti expected. He had taken the crown, yes, but it came soaked in blood and wired for ruin. Carlo Gambino's empire, once built in whispers and loyalty, was now burning under flashbulbs and indictments, and at the center of it all was Gotti, smiling through it like he was still in control. But he wasn't. Not anymore. The FBI had a war room, literally. A full-blown multi-agency command center set up just for the Gambino crime family. Whiteboards, photographs, diagrams of social clubs, surveillance maps, dozens of agents pulling double shifts. Their prime target, John Gotti. Not because he was the most dangerous, but because he was the most visible. He embarrassed them. He beat 3 federal indictments between 1986 and 1990. Acquittals, mistrials, jury tampering. Whatever it took, Gotti walked out of the courtroom like a celebrity. Every time the feds thought they had him cornered, he slipped, hence the nickname, the Teflon Don. Nothing stuck, but behind the smirk and silk ties, things were falling apart. Because Gotti wasn't Carlo. Carlo Gambino never gave speeches in public, never sat in restaurants loud enough to record, never let soldiers talk openly about business. Gotti? He laughed, joked, bragged, swore. Out loud. On tape. The FBI's golden break came in 1990, after they planted a microphone inside an air vent at the Ravenite Social Club, Gotti's hangout spot in Little Italy. It was clumsy at first, hard to pick up words through the crowd noise. But eventually, they got smart. They found a hidden apartment above the club where Gotti held his real meetings. That's where he felt safe. That's where he talked. And boy, did he talk. He talked about murders, about betrayals, about money, and worst of all, he talked about Sammy Gravano, his own underboss, the man who had helped him kill Castellano and rise to power. That guy's getting too big for his shoes. He's gonna want more than he deserves. We may have to do something about him. That was on tape. Gotti had no idea, but the FBI did. And when they played it for Sammy the Bull in a concrete interrogation room, he didn't say a word. He just listened. And then he blinked. Once. Slowly. That was all it took. Sammy Gravano flipped. The highest-ranking Mafia member in history at that point to turn government witness. He was Gotti's underboss, his right-hand man. He had killed 19 men with his own hands, and now he was going to testify. Against the man who called him brother. Why? Because Gravano saw what Gotti had become. Sloppy, paranoid, arrogant. Carlo would have never let it get this far. Carlo's code was simple. You protect the family first. Gotti? He protected his image. He made too many enemies, talked too much, trusted too little. And now, his own shadow had become the executioner. The 1992 trial was front-page news. Every camera lens in America was aimed at John Gotti, sitting stone-faced behind the defense table, wearing $1,000 suits, looking less like a boss and more like a man waiting to drown. Gravano took the stand. 9 days. He broke down the structure of the Gambino family, explained the rules, the murders, the betrayals. He named names, described bodies, recalled conversations. Even seasoned FBI agents said it was like hearing the gospel of the Mafia. And Gotti? He sat there like stone, because he knew it was over. On April 2nd, 1992, John Gotti was found guilty on all counts: murder, racketeering, obstruction, loan sharking, tax evasion, everything. Life without parole. The Teflon was gone. Now he was just a man in a cage. They locked him in USP Marion, a federal supermax prison where he spent 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. No suits, no cameras, no visitors beyond legal. Just concrete, silence, and regret. He died in 2002 from throat cancer, and not one captain in the Gambino family tried to take his place. Not the way he did. Because Gotti's reign, flashy as it was, left the family in ruins. When Carlo Gambino died, the family was an empire. At the end of Gotti's reign, it was a broken house of rats and wiretaps. Almost 80% of the hierarchy had flipped or been killed. The FBI had full blueprints of the structure, and the respect? Gone. The Gambino name used to strike fear. Now it was a punchline. It all started with one decision, one move that broke the code. The assassination of Paul Castellano. Some say it was necessary, others say it was suicide. But one thing is undeniable. Carlo Gambino never would have allowed it. Because Carlo understood something Gotti never did. You don't need to be feared to stay in power. You just need to never be seen coming. There's a moment, a quiet one, that former soldier Salvatore Sammy Gravano once told an interviewer years after the fall. He was talking about Carlo Gambino. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy. But when he walked into a room, everybody shut the fuck up. Gotti? He made noise. Carlo? He made history. And that's the truth. In the end, Carlo Gambino didn't go out in a body bag or in handcuffs or on TV. He died in his own home with the city at his feet and his enemies already buried. But the men who came after him, they tried to wear the crown and choked on it. By the time John Gotti died in 2002, the Gambino family wasn't a family anymore. It was a fractured shell, limping in circles, half blind from the beatings it had taken. The FBI had ripped it apart. Informants had burned it from the inside. Publicity had turned its mystique into a joke. But the Mafia doesn't die. It retreats, it bleeds, then it evolves. And in the early 2000s, deep in the shadows of Brooklyn, Staten Island, and Queens, the rebuilding began. They didn't do it Gotti's way. No media, no silk suits. No Ravenite social club with news vans out front. They did it the way Carlo Gambino taught them, silent, slow, and surgical. Because the truth is, after everything fell, Carlo's ghost still lingered. Not in pictures, not in names, but in methods. The younger guys, what was left of them, still studied the Carlo code. Stay quiet, stay useful, never attract heat, strike only when there's no choice left. They realized what Gotti never did. That power isn't loud. Power is undeniable. The new era began under Peter Gotti, John's older brother. He wasn't built like Carlo. Didn't have Gotti's charisma or Gravano's intelligence. He was a placeholder, someone to keep the lights on while the feds kept tearing the place apart. Peter tried, but in 2003, he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years. The Gambinos were leaderless again. And that's when the old ways crept back in. Men like Arnel Della Croce, son of Agnello, the street boss who had once kept Gotti in check, started moving under the radar. Not a boss, not flashy, but careful. Then there was Dominic Skinny Dom Pizzonia and others who had come up during Carlo's rule. They knew the value of silence, of keeping your crew close and your enemies closer. They didn't care about newspapers or public fame. They cared about money. And slowly, painfully, the Gambinos began making it again. They went back to the old rackets, construction payoffs, union skims, sports betting, loan sharking, no heroin, no big flashy hits. They avoided drug wars, avoided making new enemies. They rebuilt trust, one envelope at a time. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. They moved into Long Island, into New Jersey, into South Florida. Not with force, but through alliances, marriages, partnerships. It was quiet, almost boring, but it worked, because the goal wasn't to become kings. The goal was to last. By 2010, the Gambino family was no longer the powerhouse it once was, but it was functional. It could earn, it could influence, it could still kill if it needed to. But now those killings weren't messy. They were business decisions. No one called them the Dapper Don anymore. There was no Don, just a committee of quiet men holding what was left of the kingdom together, and in every sit-down, in every decision, they asked the same question. What would Carlo have done? Because for all the blood and noise that came after him, Carlo Gambino remained the model. He was the proof it could be done right. No prison time. No betrayal, no war, no spectacle, no fall from grace, just a quiet reign and a quiet death in a quiet house in Brooklyn. That was the goal. Not glory, but peace, earned through fear, loyalty, and silence. But even with that blueprint, the new Gambinos had one problem. The world had changed. There were no more neighborhood kids dying to be made men. There were no more factories and unions to control like in the 50s and 60s. The streets didn't respect suits anymore. They respected guns and fast cash. The Mafia's power was no longer absolute. It had competitors now. Russian mobs, Albanian crews, Nigerian fraud rings, cartels from Mexico to Queens, and the feds. They had more tools than ever. Facial recognition, surveillance drones, data tracking, encrypted wiretaps. The days of whispered names and untraceable payphones were over, and the mob couldn't keep up. Still, the Gambino name survived, because in some parts of New York, respect is inherited, and fear never forgets. There's a story that floats around in the remnants of the underworld, a whisper passed through cigar smoke in back rooms, about a young wannabe gangster, early 20s, full of swagger, who walks into a social club in Staten Island trying to impress an old capo. He's running his mouth, talking about how he wants to be the next Gotti. The room goes silent, and the old man, dressed in gray, leans in and says, "Kid, you want to last? Then don't be Gotti. Be Gambino." The kid doesn't get it, but he will. Because Carlo Gambino's name still holds weight. Not because of violence, not because of movies, not because of headlines, but because he was the last true boss who walked away clean. He played the long game. And he won. When people talk about the Mafia today, they talk about the spectacle, the Castellano hit, the Gotti trials, the betrayals, but the real story? It's in the silence after, the slow, stubborn survival of an empire that should have died but didn't. Because somewhere in the bones of the city, Carlo's way still exists. You can still see it on quiet corners in Bensonhurst, in bars that don't advertise but never go out of business, in social clubs where nobody says a word unless they have to, in men who never speak names unless they're dead. That's where Carlo lives, not in photographs, but in the rules that still protect those who remember them. In the decades that followed Carlo Gambino's death, the American Mafia splintered. Families fell apart, bosses turned informants, the old guard vanished or died in prison. But when FBI agents sat down in task force meetings, even as late as the 2010s, one name kept coming up, not as a current threat, not as a target, but as a reference point: Carlo Gambino. The agents who had chased him, wiretapped him, followed his cars, and shook down his captains, many of them retired or buried now, left behind reports that read more like respect letters than surveillance files. They didn't like what he did, but they couldn't deny he did it better than anyone. Because Carlo didn't collapse under pressure. He didn't run when things got loud. He didn't betray. And in a world that had turned the Mafia into a parody of itself, he still stood as something rare, disciplined, focused, untouchable. That's what made him different from the ones who came after. Gotti wanted to be king of New York. Carlo already was, and he never had to shout it. In Chicago, mob bosses studied his structure: quiet commissions, trusted underbosses, clean records. In Philadelphia, the volatile families tried to mimic his methods, keeping the peace, building trust between capos. Even in Los Angeles, where the mob never grew as strong, whispers of Gambino's rules made their way across poker tables and payphones. Because Carlo Gambino didn't just run a family, he defined what a functional family looked like. The structure he left behind was copied, repackaged, and pushed into every major city where organized crime tried to survive. He didn't write a code book. He didn't need to. His life was the manual. And even law enforcement used his name when they saw things fall apart. That's how good he was. He became the standard, not for how to be loud, but for how to endure. FBI analysts said it in private reports, off the record, in late-night strategy meetings. I wish these guys were more like Gambino. It wasn't about respect for the criminal. It was about control. Because after Carlo died, what replaced him was chaos. Killers with no discipline, crews turning on each other, families fractured by greed and drugs. Gambino wouldn't have allowed it. He knew greed had to be managed. That money was important, but peace was priceless. And now, that kind of leadership was gone. The Gambino family itself, after Gotti's fall, became a quieter, smaller version of its old self. It still existed, it still earned, but it no longer ruled New York. Instead, it became a relic, an aging empire now run by cautious men who remembered Carlo's lessons but didn't have the world he had. The neighborhoods were different, the rackets were harder to protect. Everything had changed, but even so, his legacy echoed in how they moved. No press, no flash, no declarations of war, just small meetings, quiet loyalty, a return to the code. Some of the newer generations didn't get it. They grew up with social media, fast money, and no patience. They didn't understand the long game. They wanted it all now. And when they tried, they ended up in prison or in holes in the ground. Because the world still worked the same way it did in 1931. Maybe the tools were different, but the rules, still Carlo's. In prison yards across the country, his name meant something, not as a ghost story, but as a warning. Carlo didn't need a knife in his hand. He didn't need to yell or brag. He just needed your name. And once it was in his mouth, your days were numbered. Even now there are old-timers sitting in halfway houses and retirement communities in South Florida who say it proudly, almost wistfully. He was the last real boss. Some of them were soldiers, others were just errand boys. But they all knew the same thing. Carlo Gambino wasn't lucky. He wasn't charming. He wasn't even especially violent. He was just smarter than everybody else, and quieter. He didn't run toward opportunity. He let it walk into his hand. And when trouble came knocking, he made it disappear. There was no trial, no loud testimony, no media circus. Just a cold decision, a silent nod, and a body that never got found. That was the genius of it. He didn't have to be seen. Because his presence was already everywhere. Even the judges who passed sentences on his captains whispered about him behind chambers' doors. Carlo never ended up in my courtroom, one said years later, and I don't think he ever would have. He understood power, not the kind you flex, but the kind you keep until the grave. And that's where he rests now. Brooklyn, unmarked, unbothered, still more feared than some bosses who came after him. He didn't need a mausoleum. His legacy was written in silence. You can see it in the way younger guys enter a room with their heads down. You can feel it in the tension when someone mentions his name at a sit-down, and the room suddenly gets quiet. He's been gone for decades, and yet his playbook is still open, not just in New York, but in Boston, Detroit, Chicago, even Miami. Everywhere, there's still something left of the old world. His presence hums beneath the floorboards. He taught men that if you play it right, you don't need second chances. You just need to make the first one count. That's what the new kids don't understand. They think killing is power. That fear comes from headlines and reputation. But Gambino? He built a reputation so quiet, the silence itself became fear. He could destroy a man without raising his voice. And when he did speak, you listened. Because you knew, this man does not waste breath. Even today, former FBI agents say it with a strange kind of reverence. They say, Gambino beat us without firing a bullet. He didn't beat the law. He outlived it. He didn't need to hide, because he was never seen. There's power in that. And that's what makes him unforgettable. Not because of the blood, but because he was the one man who knew how to control it. And then, when the work was done, he didn't cling to power. He didn't go out with drama. He just died in his own bed, with his house in order. The last real boss, the one who never lost, and the one no one dared to imitate again, because they knew they couldn't. There was only one Carlo. There will never be another. Long after Carlo Gambino was buried, his name never was. It lingered in courtrooms, in federal reports, in late-night whispers, inside cars parked on dim Brooklyn blocks. There were guys in their 20s who didn't know his face, didn't know his voice, didn't know his story. But they still walked like him, moved like him, repeated rules they never read, only inherited. Because once a man like Carlo defines the game, every player who follows plays in his shadow. In the 1990s and early 2000s, after the John Gotti circus died down and the Mafia lost its grip on the city's bones, what remained of the five families tried to pull the pieces back together. No more headlines, no more dapper dons, no more parading down Mulberry Street with gold chains and paparazzi. That era was done. And what came next was colder, smaller, more cautious, but in many ways more faithful to what Carlo wanted all along. There's a reason federal indictments after 2002 didn't carry the same heat. Sure, busts still happened. Guys got hit for extortion, racketeering, gambling, unions. But the big, loud trials, the ones with dozens of cameras and mafia wives crying outside courthouses, gone. Because the guys running the show now remembered what Carlo always preached. The man who talks the most dies the fastest. You look at someone like Jackie D'Amico, Gotti's successor briefly. He ran things with a quiet professionalism that stood in contrast to the suits and swagger that came before. He wasn't a visionary, he wasn't a gambler, but he understood the value of calm, and that alone made him more Carlo's kind of boss than the two before him. Then you had Nicholas Little Nick Corazzo, a man with old school blood in his veins, respected, feared, smart enough to operate below the radar. He didn't speak out of turn, he didn't grab headlines, he kept a low profile, and for a while he kept the family stable. But even those men, even those who tried to carry the torch respectfully, weren't building empires anymore. They were keeping the lights on. The city was different now. The power was scattered. The cops were more patient, more connected, more subtle. Everything Carlo warned them about had come true. The heat, the technology, the snitches, the ego. Carlo knew that the American Mafia would survive only if it remembered its roots. Fear without noise, power without pride, loyalty without reward. That's why his structure was so hard to kill. Even as individual families collapsed, his model lived on. You saw it in Chicago, where remnants of the outfit held onto their rackets not with blood, but with leverage. You saw it in Detroit, where the old guard still respected the traditions Gambino helped define, and you even saw it in the feds themselves. By the 2010s, FBI agents were studying Carlo Gambino not as a suspect, but as a blueprint. He wasn't treated like a criminal anymore. He was treated like a case study. How do you control 500 men, move millions in illegal revenue, orchestrate hits, silence witnesses, and stay out of prison? You study Carlo. One retired agent told a journalist off the record, "If more of them had done it his way, we'd have been out of a job." That's not an exaggeration, because while most mafia bosses get remembered for their mistakes, Carlo gets remembered for his patience. No mistakes, no last words, no courtroom speeches. He just left. And what he left behind was more than a power vacuum. It was a standard. Young guys coming up in the 2010s, if they were smart, weren't asking how to be like Gotti anymore. They were asking how to not end up like him. They were looking at the way Carlo built a life not of fame, but of security. The guy had a family, a home, grandkids. He sat at the head of the most powerful crime family in America and still walked to the corner for bread like a regular old man. He didn't need to flex. His power was obvious because it didn't need to be proven. That's something the new generation is struggling to understand. A guy wearing an ankle bracelet and posting photos on Instagram with rented Ferraris isn't a gangster. He's bait. The smart ones? They're not online. They're not loud. They're not even interesting. Because that's how you survive now. You live like Carlo. And the ones who don't? They're gone before the year's out. Dead or flipped. It's not romantic. It's not glamorous. But it's the truth. That's why even now, guys with no connection to the old days still whisper his name. They say it with respect, like a warning. Be careful. Don't get too big. Remember what Carlo would have done. It's not nostalgia. It's fear with memory. And you know what? There's a new kind of loyalty that comes from that. Not loyalty to a face or a flag, but to a code. You still see it in small places. The way envelopes are passed hand to hand, never mentioned aloud. The way disputes are handled with conversation, not gunfire. The way soldiers are trained not to react emotionally, but to disappear, listen, nod. All of that? Carlo's system. And it still works, even with the world upside down, even with cops smarter than ever and eyes on every corner. Because Carlo didn't build for power, he built for continuity. And even though his name is rarely said out loud now, it echoes in every decision the smart guys make. Even the feds, deep down, they miss him. Not because they liked him, but because the world made more sense when men like him were in charge. There was order, structure. Now, they chase street gangs with no hierarchy. They investigate cartels with no code. They chase cyber criminals who don't care about respect or loyalty, only speed and money. The game's changed, and it's uglier, colder, less human. That's why Carlo feels like the last page of an old book, one nobody's writing anymore, but one still worth rereading, especially if you want to understand how power used to work, not with explosions, but with whispers. There's a line some older guys used to say in bars in Bensonhurst when the talk got too loud. Keep Carlo's name out your mouth unless you can carry what it means. Most couldn't. Most still can't. But the smart ones, they stay quiet, they nod, and they walk the long way home. Because even in 2025, the best thing you can be in the underworld, unremarkable, unnoticed, undefeated, just like Carlo, the man who built an empire with silence and buried it so deep we're still digging for pieces. By the time the 1980s rolled in, Carlo Gambino had been dead for nearly a decade. But his name still meant something, more than fear, more than respect. It meant structure. A name that didn't echo through tabloids or get dragged into wiretaps. It whispered, it moved, it survived. But names don't protect you forever, not when the men who inherit them forget where they came from. That was the curse of Carlo's bloodline. Because what came after him wasn't loyalty, it was entitlement. Men who thought they could inherit power like a wristwatch. They thought being a Gambino by blood meant they didn't have to earn it the way Carlo did. But Carlo's empire was never meant to be passed down like a family heirloom. It was meant to be carried, with silence, with fear, with weight. And nobody, not even those who shared his last name, were strong enough to carry it. Not like he did. Not even close. The first mistake was already in motion before Carlo's body hit the ground. He had chosen Paul Castellano as his successor. Blood through marriage, smart, cold, calculated, at least on paper. But Paul wasn't built like Carlo. He had the numbers, not the nerves. He could read a balance sheet, but he couldn't read a room. And worse, he didn't have the streets behind him, the guys who knew how to move dope without getting caught, how to make numbers flow through unions, how to collect without causing waves. Those guys never trusted him. Because Paul was a boss by appointment, not by fear. Not by war, not by blood earned, just blood shared. And when men start thinking that blood is enough, that's when empires rot. But Carlo didn't live to see Paul fall. He didn't see the spark in John Gotti's eyes, that hunger for chaos, that thirst for attention, that itch to take the crown by force. If he had, maybe he would have changed things. Or maybe not. Carlo never rushed decisions. He believed the right man would survive the wrong ones. But Paul didn't survive anything. He was buried in the sidewalk outside a steakhouse while his driver still had one foot on the brake. And with him, Carlo's bloodline lost control of the empire, just like that. It should have ended there, but it didn't. Because Carlo's biological relatives, not just in-laws, not appointees, but blood-born Gambinos, were still out there. Some wanted in, some wanted out. And some wanted to wear a name they didn't earn, like a crown that never fit. One of them was Emmanuel Manny Gambino, Carlo's nephew. Manny wasn't a boss, he wasn't a thinker, he wasn't even a real earner, but he had the name, and he wore it like armor. He walked into restaurants expecting comped meals. He threatened people with nothing but his bloodline. He tried to collect on power he didn't understand. He didn't follow Carlo's rules. He didn't watch, didn't wait, didn't know how to read the room. He brought noise, sloppiness, attention, and attention was death. One, in 1973, Manny was kidnapped by a low-level independent crew with no real ties to the 5 families. They thought they could score a ransom from the Godfather's nephew. What they didn't realize was that Manny was more of a name than a weapon. He wasn't protected. He wasn't loved. He was tolerated. And once he went missing, nobody lifted a finger to save him. Carlo never said a word publicly, never made a scene. And when they found Manny's body in a shallow New Jersey grave, no arrests, no revenge, just silence. Because Carlo had already buried him in his mind long before they put him in the dirt. You don't wear the Gambino name like a trophy. You earn it in blood, or you die in shame. That was the warning. And still, decades later, more men kept trying. Other relatives, distant cousins, extended family, tried sneaking back into the life under the safety of the name. Some were small-time operators, low-level gamblers, street pushers, guys with more ego than edge. They thought the name would protect them. It didn't. It made them targets. Because once you claimed that name, every move you made was watched. Every mistake you made was punished. And not always by rivals, sometimes by your own people. Because in the Mafia, no one hates an imposter more than the real thing. And the name Gambino, it didn't forgive. By the 2000s, the actual bloodline of Carlo Gambino had faded into the background. No direct descendants stepped up. No son took over. No grandson rose through the ranks. It wasn't like the movies. There's no throne room, no candlelit ceremony. There were just streets, louder now, dirtier, more dangerous, with cops smarter than ever and enemies who didn't play by old rules. The last man who could have led the family in Carlo's image died when Carlo did. What came after were men trying to survive, not trying to lead. And survival doesn't build legacy. It just buys time. But in those back rooms, where the lights are dim and no phones are allowed, where names are spoken like prayers or curses, Carlo still lives. Not as a bloodline, but as a blueprint. They say his name when someone tries to rise too fast. They say it when a young guy starts acting like a cowboy, making too much noise, drawing heat from the wrong places. They say it when there's a decision to make, one that requires not just power, but patience. What would Carlo do? That question still stops rooms cold, because even if the Gambino name is worn by nobodies now, the man behind it still haunts every seat of power in the underworld. He had no Instagram account, no mugshot that went viral, no courtroom confession, just a record of never losing. And men remember that, especially the ones who've spent years cleaning up the mess his bloodline left behind. The family today? It still exists, quiet, smaller, less connected, less feared, but functional. Guys still pay tribute, still run gambling rings and loan sharking, still collect envelopes and broker silent truces. They don't wear pinky rings. They wear gray. They don't pose for pictures. They hide their faces. They don't try to be Carlo. Because they know they can't. But they live by his shadow. Because the minute they forget what happens when you wear the Gambino name without the Gambino code, they end up like Manny. Buried. Forgotten. A warning carved into the cold. And that's the truth of blood in this life. It means nothing if it doesn't carry the weight. Carlo Gambino didn't build his empire on family. He built it on control. And when his family tried to take it back, they learned the hard way. You don't inherit fear. You become it. Or you get buried by it. In the cold rooms of FBI field offices and federal task force centers, there's something that never quite sits right with agents who study organized crime. It's not the killers who got away. It's not the money that vanished. It's not even the bodies that were never found. It's the name they never beat. Gambino, not the man, the machine he left behind. Because Carlo Gambino didn't just lead a family. He designed a system so clean, so controlled, that even decades later, when law enforcement has more tools than ever, they still haven't found a better model to work from. And that fact, drive some of them crazy. Carlo never needed a phone. He didn't need paperwork. He didn't even trust his own voice sometimes. He believed in two things: trust and time. That was his edge, always. He didn't react. He waited. He didn't guess. He listened. And he never, ever repeated himself. That's why the FBI spent 30 years chasing him and never touched him. They had photos. They had reports. They had testimonies from terrified soldiers and jealous captains. But they never had Carlo. Not on tape, not on the stand, not in handcuffs. One retired FBI agent, part of the original Gambino task force back in the late 60s, put it bluntly in a taped interview decades later. "We built our careers studying him, not catching him, studying him. He was the playbook for how not to get caught." There was no bravado in the man's voice, just something close to awe. Because law enforcement didn't just fail to catch Carlo. They failed to understand him until it was too late. The modern FBI, DEA, ATF, they all run off algorithms now. Pattern recognition, data mining, heat maps, phone intercepts, digital surveillance. And yet, they still hand out Carlo Gambino case files to rookies, not as examples of criminal behavior, but as examples of discipline, organization, and psychological warfare. Because Gambino didn't need to intimidate. He just needed to exist. That was the thing most agents couldn't shake. He didn't leave behind scars. He left behind silence. And that silence was more dangerous than a room full of guns. They say the first time the FBI realized they were outclassed by Carlo was in 1963. The year Joseph Valachi flipped and testified publicly before Congress, the first rat, the first real crack in the code. Valachi gave up names, explained terms, drew maps, told the world what Cosa Nostra meant. For most families, it was catastrophic, but not for Carlo, because his name wasn't mentioned once. Not directly, not by Valachi, not by any rat that decade, because Carlo never told anyone enough to be betrayed. That was his genius. He was so cautious, so calculated, so above suspicion, that even the ones who turned on the entire system couldn't describe how he worked. One prosecutor, after reading dozens of pages of Valachi's testimony, reportedly said, "This man talks about 100 soldiers and 10 bosses, but not a single real thing about Gambino. Either he didn't know, or he was too afraid to speak the truth." And that was the real power Carlo wielded. Not violence, not money, but invisibility. In the world of organized crime, everyone gets spotted eventually. A camera, a wire, a tax return. But Carlo? He passed through walls. Agents would get tips. Carlo's at this address, that safe house, this social club. By the time they got there, empty chair, fresh coffee, a newspaper still warm, no prints, no trace, like chasing a ghost who read the news before you did. But it wasn't magic. It was preparation. Carlo used men like pieces on a board, always 2 moves ahead. He let others speak for him, trusted messengers, always rotating, always compartmentalized. If you spoke to Carlo, you never knew who spoke before you, or after. That kind of silence becomes armor. It can't be tapped, can't be flipped, can't be subpoenaed. It's just gone. By the 1970s, Gambino had agents so frustrated they were leaking their own failures to the press. They couldn't tap his house, no phone line. They couldn't tail him. He walked half the time. They couldn't find bank accounts. He didn't use banks. He'd moved tens of thousands in envelopes tucked into bakery bags. Not once did he sign a check. He didn't even drive. The FBI called him the hardest target in American crime history. And that wasn't bragging. That was a eulogy. Because when he died in 1976, the agency didn't celebrate. They sighed. He beat them, lived a full life, built $1 billion empire, buried his enemies, watched 3 presidents come and go, and died of natural causes in his own bed. No trial, no courtroom breakdown, no prison jumpsuit, just a closed casket and 1,000 unsolved questions. That defeat changed the way the FBI worked. They moved faster, got more aggressive, expanded RICO laws, built networks of informants, chased patterns harder, because they never wanted another Carlo Gambino. But in trying to stop the next one, They accidentally proved his system worked. They began using his structure in reverse. The FBI started organizing their own hierarchy like Cosa Nostra. Specialized teams, tight channels, need-to-know layers. They didn't just investigate Carlo, they copied him. That's how deep his influence ran. He turned the men chasing him into mirror images, and they still couldn't catch him. Even now, when task forces go after the modern mob, they work from a Carlo-built playbook. Figure out the structure, find the messenger, trace the ear, not the mouth. Because if the real boss is smart, he's not talking to anyone directly. That's not speculation. That's Carlo's law. Still quoted, still respected, still feared. And if you ask the senior guys at Quantico, the ones who write profiles on international crime syndicates, cartel bosses, Russian networks, they'll tell you the same thing. We've never found anyone cleaner than Gambino. Others made more noise. Others made more money. But no one lasted like he did. That's the legacy. Not just in the Mafia, but in the law itself. Because every time the FBI tries to shut down another network, another cell, another underground ring, they go back to the same principle. Who's pulling strings without leaving fingerprints? They're all looking for the next Gambino. And deep down, they hope they never find him. Because even now, with all the technology in the world, one man like Carlo, operating with that kind of discipline, that kind of foresight, could still run circles around them. He was a crime lord who never got charged, a myth who left real bodies, a ghost who walked into meetings and out of investigations without a sound. He didn't break the law, he walked beside it and disappeared before it knew he was there. That's what made him different. That's what makes him eternal. Not because he beat the system, but because he built a better one. And all these years later, no one on either side of the law has figured out how to top it. He never saw it collapse. The courts, the cameras, the rats, the trials, the mess. He was gone before the Mafia turned into a headline machine, before flashy suits replaced silence, before courtroom tears replaced unspoken loyalty. Carlo Gambino didn't live to see the life he helped define get twisted into something loud, sloppy, and broken. And maybe that's the reason why his name survived longer than the men who tried to wear his crown. He walked away on his own terms, but the world didn't walk with him. October 15th, 1976. He was 74, old, tired, but undefeated. He had dinner with family that night, real family, his wife. A few relatives, nothing flashy, no social club parade, no underboss kissing his ring, just food, wine, and the quiet confidence of a man who had outlived all his enemies. He walked upstairs around 9 p.m., and sometime between then and midnight, his heart stopped. No struggle, no drama, just stillness, the silent dawn, gone in silence. No one called it a tragedy. They called it inevitable. When the news hit the street, Brooklyn didn't cry. It paused. Old captains stopped mid-sentence, rivals sat down. FBI agents poured coffee, reread old files, and realized they would never get him. There wouldn't be a trial. No televised downfall. No last confession in front of a grand jury. Just a cold bed and a closed casket. And for some of those agents, that burned worse than defeat, because they hadn't lost to a ghost. They'd lost to a man who mastered time. Carlo Gambino never rushed a move. He waited. For decades, he watched kings rise and burn. He watched friends become traitors and traitors turn to dust. He watched bosses get pulled off the street in cuffs while cameras flashed in their faces. And he made one decision. That would never be him. He saw the game for what it was, a long road, not a fast climb. He didn't want glory, he wanted control. And once he had it, he made it boring. That was his secret. The streets weren't afraid of him because he was cruel. They were afraid because he made dying feel quiet. No headlines, no shootouts, just a mistake. And then nothing. At his funeral, there were no limos lined up for miles, no gold caskets, no parade of soldiers in dark coats, just a simple service in Bensonhurst, a priest, a few whispers. And men in hats who didn't say his name too loud, even in death, because you didn't say Carlo's name unless you had to. Even gone, he made people speak softer. Some of his closest men never replaced him. They didn't want to. They ran crews, made money, enforced rules. But they didn't try to be Carlo, because they knew better. You don't replace a man like that. You survive him, and hope you don't disappoint him, even when he's not there. The day Carlo Gambino died wasn't just the end of a man. It was the end of an era of rules, of structure, of unspoken codes that mattered more than money. After Carlo, everything shifted. The commission still met, the families still operated, the envelopes still moved, but the weight behind the order, the respect behind the rules, it thinned. The Mafia didn't collapse overnight, it eroded. Piece by piece, and every piece lost came with a new kind of noise. In the 1980s, Gotti made it public. In the 1990s, Gravano made it treason. By the 2000s, the Mafia was mostly memory with income, still earning, still functioning, but no longer feared the same way. Because once Carlo was gone, there was no one left to remind the next generation how it was supposed to be done. You want to know why they still talk about him in FBI debriefings? Why his name shows up in documentaries, in agent memoirs, in darkly lit sit-downs where the last real old-timers drink cheap coffee and count ghosts? It's not because he was the most violent. He wasn't. It's not because he made the most money. He didn't. It's because he was the most complete. No scandals, no court testimony, no sloppy hits, no rats in his inner circle, no prison, no betrayal. Just a clean line from rise to reign to rest. No stumbles, no panic, just strategy. He didn't just beat the law, he beat time itself. Every man who came after him, every boss who tried to copy his playbook, always made one mistake. They thought they could look like him without thinking like him. They wore the suits, they gave the orders, they played boss. But Carlo never played anything, he just was. He didn't pretend to be respected. He moved so carefully, with such precision, that men feared the very idea of disappointing him. And not because he'd kill them, but because he'd never have to. He'd just erase them, like they were never real. His legacy isn't in a building or a statue or a holiday in some neighborhood in Brooklyn. His legacy is in the way men still flinch when his name is said out loud. It's in the way younger soldiers lower their eyes when the old-timers mention him. It's in the silence that falls after the question gets asked. You think you could have lasted under Carlo? Most don't answer, because the ones who get it, they know. The answer is no. He wasn't lucky. He wasn't gifted. He was just disciplined in a way that almost no man ever will be again. He saw power for what it was, not a prize, but a burden. Not something you flaunt, something you protect from idiots who want to be seen. And that's why his death was more than just a loss to the Gambino family. It was a loss to the very concept of how to rule quietly. If you're smart, you study him. If you're in the life, you fear him. If you're in law enforcement, you respect him, even if you won't admit it. If you're a kid growing up hearing these names, thinking about the old days, dreaming of building something like he built, stop. You won't. He already did it. Perfectly. And when perfection dies, it doesn't come back. It just echoes. In phone calls that never say names, in social clubs where no phones are allowed, in the quiet smile of a man who knows the game but doesn't play it out loud. That's Carlo Gambino's final lesson. Power that survives is never loud. It's never proud. It's never in the paper. It's just there, watching, waiting, always one move ahead. And when it leaves the room, you feel it. Not because something happened, but because nothing ever needs to. That's the weight of real power. That's what Carlo carried until his last breath, and what no one since has ever truly picked up. Because it wasn't just his name, it was his code. And he took it with him to the grave.